So I wanted to, I guess, start off with my own personal introduction. Again, hi, I'm Karen Ullman. I'm an Education Outreach Coordinator for the Washington State Department of Agriculture. I'm here representing the WSDA Regional Markets Program. As a program, our general goal is to be supporting the economic viability of small and direct marketing farms. And we do that through a variety of methods, including training, guidance, technical assistance, and resources. And during this, this period of time, we're really trying to be responsive to needs and questions. So if there's ways that we can be better supportive, please do let us know how we can help out in that way. And just a little tidbit of background information. One of my kind of core functionalities over almost nearly 6 years I've been working at WSDA has been to help farms understand, navigate, meet various produce safety, regulatory, and buyer-driven requirements. On that knowledge today, but there's a lot of new information that we've been working to compile and provide for you in a consolidated method that's really here today. But I'm hoping that it not just serves our produce farms in Washington, but I think a lot of the knowledge here can also extend to, ranchers, dairy operations, other food processors or businesses. I think there's some key takeaways that will hopefully be applicable across the board. Again, there will be points where we'll open up the discussion a little bit more. If you're not familiar with the Zoom, there is an option to raise your hand. Chris, did you want to just touch on the processes for that, just in case anyone's not familiar with how to access that piece?
Hi, everyone. This is Laura Raymond with WSDA. I'm going to jump in for Chris. We like to keep it real here at WSDA, and I think Chris needed to pop away to do a very familiar work from home duty, which is assist children. So while he's taking care of that, I want to let everyone know you are muted, as Karen mentioned. And I will be tracking that and unmuting people if you want to speak. So the way we're going to track that is by you raising your hand. So if you are looking at your screen, you can see at the bottom of the screen there is you can see a list of participants. If you click on that, a box will appear and you can see everybody who's on this call. When you find yourself on that list of participants, if you hover your mouse over your name, you should have an option to, under More, you should have an option to raise hand. People seeing that? So if I see your hand, you can also lower your hand and I will unmute you during our discussion period.
Great.
Also, I want to encourage people to use the chat box. So again, if you don't already have that open and visible in your view, you can see a chat. It looks like a little dialog box on the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you'll open a chat box and you can type in questions or messages that the rest of the group can see. Okay, thanks.
Okay, next slide. Okay. I just want to start briefly by restating some of the directives that we've gotten under Governor Inslee's order, and that has also been reflected by the leadership within our own agency, which is to recognize that food and agricultural businesses have been identified as critical infrastructure in our state. And such as under this order can remain open to help us maintain and preserve our Washington and local food supply. With that being said, I recognize that there may be a lot of real and valid concerns that you as farm employees, farm managers, resource people who work with these entities have a lot of questions around how to continue to do that safely, and not just for yourself, but for your family, for your employees, and of course for your customers. So my sincere hope is that we try to address and alleviate some of the concerns that you may be having. If there's something we can't answer, we're going to work our darnest to get the answers for you or point you to the people that do know. I've also been more recently reflecting on, as you see here, Governor Inslee's comments that we're in uncharted territory. This is affecting not just the ag sector, but generally across the board, nationwide. But to remind you that there is a resiliency within our local food system, and in some fashions, small farms, the local food maybe have the skill set to respond to these quicker changes, may have some advantages already within your toolkit of experiences related to, for example, a shorter food supply chain, potentially, a more contained or a smaller workforce that you may be more able to manage. And when we go into talking about enforcing good practices on your farm related to hand washing, related to social distancing, etc. So I'm going to do my best to refer to those resiliency points throughout my presentation. As a side note, if you're at all having questions or concerns about whether you fit into those governor orders related to if you're an essential business, check down at the link below for further information. Okay, so what are our overarching goals that we want to cover today? I've broken it down into 3 separate sections. I'm guessing that there's been a big onslaught of news around this topic. So we're going to stay pretty high level, in particular related to just COVID in general. And then I'm hoping we shift pretty quickly into more tangible practices that you can start to adapt on your farm or your food business operation. The key goals are really going to focus on points number 2, 3, and 4 that involve, managing worker health and hygiene, preventing spread, as humans can be vectors for this type of virus. We're going to be talking about how to implement the social distancing requirements that have come out from CDC, Washington, and others that we're seeing being forced nationwide. And then kind of a backdrop to all of that, that's an additional layer of safety precautions. We're going to be talking about cleaning and sanitizing and disinfecting surfaces, and how to do that in a way that is effective, that's best recommended at this point. So we'll touch on that as well. And then the 5th point is just to kind of bring it all together and reinforce key practices that you may already be doing on your operation. So let's dive in. I want to spend 1 or 2 slides on COVID overview in general. This is what we know now. What we know now is that this virus is primarily spread, we think, most commonly through person-to-person contact and or potentially in some cases via cross-contamination. In that, for example, if someone had been someone who's sick or someone who's just has the virus within their system, even asymptomatically, meaning they're not showing any signs of symptoms, it's possible that through speaking, sneezing, coughing, that those bodily fluids could get transferred to contact surfaces. Someone else could touch that same surface, and if they're going to be touching their face, their mouth, their eyes, I'm going to try really hard not to touch my face or eyes throughout this presentation to be reinforcing what I'm preaching here. But that's the main focus in terms of our risk production that we're focusing on with this. Now, this may be a little bit different from some of the food safety education that you've received in the past. Still continue to follow your existing food safety protocols. Those are going to be great foundations for what we're going to be talking about today. Keep in mind, and it can be really challenging about this virus, if you haven't already heard, those asymptomatic people that may not be feeling sick can be carriers of this disease. So that's why we are extra enforcing this social distancing. The recommendation here is a minimum of 6 feet. So that's our primary goal in trying to mitigate disease. So in the transmission. So I'm just going to reinforce these mitigation strategies that I think are core functions, not for this sector, but for other sectors, even within your home life. These can be applied across the board. So again, the objectives today to be discussing would be social distancing, number 1, core mitigation strategy. Number 2, these are all we're going to talk about in more depth. Frequent and adequate hand washing. Hand washing is super important because if you think about it, there are so many different things that we touch throughout our daily lives, from, throughout the farm, throughout our lives outside of the farm. We could be retraining a lot in that process. Third of all, we are going to be talking about that sanitation of high food contact surfaces in particular. You'll notice that I'm really trying to link a lot throughout this presentation. So anytime you're seeing like blue with an underline, that indicates that there's a URL for further resources. Feel free to be using these types of materials in your own trainings. We've tried to point you to what we think is the best piece of information out there at this time. Okay, now in terms of, this concept is maybe a little bit of a shift in terms of how we typically think of food safety education. And I think maybe this is the topic that's, even for myself, that it takes more, it takes a shift in how we're thinking. So the point here is that up until this point, and this is supported by CDC, USDA, and FDA, we don't have reports at this time that the illnesses that we have confirmed through testing do not indicate, backtracking in epidemiological work, that this has been transmitted via food and food packaging. The reason for that is that this virus is different. I would put it in a different category than the food-borne illnesses that we typically think about related to food. So examples would be, in terms of viruses, typically, we're working against, for example, norovirus, listeria. These types of viruses tend to be quite resilient in various environments, have fairly strong resiliency. I would not put COVID-19 in the same category as these other viruses that we tend to think of as foreign illnesses. The reason for that is that the thought is that even if, particles of COVID-19 were on a piece of produce, when that produce or other food items are consumed, well, one, either if they are consumed, there's a good likelihood that the virus would be destroyed in the process of going through our stomach and our GI tract. There's also potentially less risk here related to food, because foods outside of produce that are typically consumed raw, other food items, dairies, meat, otherwise, are more likely to undergo, a cooking or heat process step that is likely to reduce, if not fully reduce, but at least significantly reduce the presence of coronavirus. Additionally, the coronavirus family, and as viruses standardly, how they work is that they need our human host to survive. So their ability to grow on a food product surface is it's very difficult for them in those. They need those viruses. So those hosts, very preliminary studies shown on the right here give us some indication of how long they may be staying on food contact or other surfaces. We're pointing to the food contact surfaces here for our audience, but these are the days up until which initial studies have indicated how long they might survive. So overall, not too stable in these environments. 2 to 3 days for plastic and stainless steel, 24 for cardboard, 4 for copper. And then we think 3 hours when, so someone were to sneeze, so remaining as air droplets in our environment. Again, this goes back to why social distancing is so important, trying to maintain that 6 feet. And so let's talk more in the presentation about ways to apply that on your operation. Again, I want to swiftly move into some actionable items for you and
Karen,
things that you can be.
Just had one question, clarification on how food packaging might be different than other hard surfaces for cross-contamination.
So these studies are looking, they specifically looked at plastic, stainless steel, cardboard. Those are going to be surface types that we might more commonly see as food packaging. There may be other food packaging items or surfaces that people may be using. At this time, I'm not aware of what the resiliency is of the virus on those surfaces. I think more information to come on that. If anyone has additions on that may fill in a little bit more, feel free to comment for everyone else to learn from. Okay. Let's talk about, how do we protect our workers in this environment as well? So first off, I would say you want to be educating yourself. I know that particularly folks that are in a management position or who are owners may be feeling an extra level of burden or responsibility in this category. I would start by knowing the symptoms, educating yourselves. They're listed out here. The key ones: cough, a dry cough, fever, shortness of breath. Some businesses are implementing kind of daily health checks. I think on a small business level, you can maybe have an advantage there where you may not have as many employees coming to work in shifts all at one time. So I think you maybe have an advantage here in ability to more finely attune to the needs of your employees. There are some additional signs of symptoms that seem to be initial, so keep an eye out for those. Try to have as good of an open line of communication with your employees. Other things that I wanted to make a nod to is also just in general to be keeping tabs on the health and well-being of your staff. Of course, under stressful situations that I think we all might be facing to different degrees at this point, stress can have impacts on effectiveness at work, and also it could also be reducing our immune systems and ability to recover in the event that you were to be infected by this. So overall health and well-being is just something that we encourage you to be tracking. Taking a next step forward, going into a little bit more depth. You're not in this alone. There are lots of resources for thinking about how to manage your policies around sick leave. You may want to be updating your sick leave policy to include some key training items that are pictured out on the right here side. So putting extra emphasis on hand washing, good hygiene around covering your mouth or sneezing into a tissue, avoiding touching, eyes, nose, mouth, and then the social distancing we'll talk about more. Number one, if someone is sick or if they're having any indication of signs or symptoms, the first best thing you can do is to encourage employees to stay home if they are sick. This might be a good time to put an extra emphasis, again, on the communication, but also encourage employees to the best extent possible to be reporting to you when they're not feeling well, and to your best ability, make sure they know that they're not going to be punished for admitting that they're sick. This is not the time to tough it out, not just for your employees, but for yourself too. Anyone that's working on the farm, sometimes we may forget that any training that you would be providing to employees really should also be carried forward to visitors, to neighbors, to family who may be working on your operation. Don't forget to include them in this conversation as well. We won't get into a lot of conversation here, but
we had a question earlier about volunteers.
Okay.
Would you categorize them volunteer crews under that as well, or would they be treated any differently?
I would include them as well. Anyone that's coming to your operation, I think it's best practice, best security for you and the spread. I wouldn't, I guess you can make a decision call in terms of how, to their extent to which they're coming to your property. You may have some deliveries where there is really no interaction per se. For example, if there's someone that's just droppage, maybe you kind of draw the line there in terms of what is the extent of their visiting, how close are they, how much are they engaging with your actual operation. But again, social distancing, if possible, would be encouraged. We're going to talk about that in a little bit in terms of how to manage deliveries and packages. We'll touch on that. So again, I've linked here if you have questions about how to protect employees in terms of what are the current policies and reimbursement opportunities. I would start with Washington State Department, Employment Security Department, other larger entities at a federal scale, OSHA, CDC have put together really extensive recommendations. I would just, borrow from the guidance they've put out. That way you know that you're following what the standards are out there. So those would be two solid resources. One resource I came across was from University of Vermont, where they actually had a written state of policies about these types of items that they had employees sign off on as a kind of a formal commitment. And that's something you could consider. It would be a way, it's something maybe you could email to employees on their own. That's an alternative that seems useful for you. Okay. Now, I am sure that there are likely already have at least one bathroom and hand washing access on your farm. In this environment, you might consider increasing the number of hand washing stations in key areas where you're wanting to encourage a point for them to be washing their hands. Some points to consider about when to wash your hands that were already established within some of our existing rules and regulations are outlined here. And this is tailored towards the farm environment. So they're visualized here, before starting work, after using the toilet, after working with animals. I would say that there are some additional pieces about when to wash hands that I would put a finer emphasis on. For example, CDC has recommended to be washing your hands after being out in a public setting, whether that's going to the grocery store or maybe someone on your farm is gone out to a farm supply store to get more materials. I would encourage them to be washing their hands when they get back from that situation. I would also encourage washing hands before touching eyes, nose, and mouth. And there's some additional outlines that CDC has in their when and how to wash hands. This visual is downloadable on our website, so feel free to borrow that, post it up. An extra precaution that's not included in here would be to also be using a towel to turn off the faucet and make sure you're disposing of single-use items as quickly as possible. Make those trash available so that it's easy for people to do. Making it easy and accessible, particularly when we're thinking about farms that may be several acres, where are those points that it would be useful strategically to include these? It doesn't have to be fancy, as you see in this image. Here's an example of a hand washing station. Of course, you want to be using potable water and soap. Potable water and soap are the key pieces here. We really need that extra soap scrubbing space that should do fairly well in destroying or at least reducing the virus on your hands and to reduce spread. Okay. What if for whatever reason you hand washing is not available? If your hands are not visibly dirty, an alcohol-based sanitizer could be used if it's got 60% concentration rate. That could be an alternative. That's something that could provide some more assurances to employees that you're taking that extra level and step of care. If you're having trouble finding sanitizers, here is an example of how to make hand sanitizer at home. What's been indicated to me is that most of these have been found, the ingredients been found at local stores. I know there's been shortages of various items. I'm curious to hear if anyone wants to comment where they have had success finding certain supplies that have been in high demand. Curious to see if anyone's found some creative options for that. Another, in terms of supply item that you could be providing to employees, staff, would be gloves. The key takeaway with any of these additional protective equipment, gloves do not replace proper hand washing practices. In fact, you must be washing your hands prior to applying gloves. In these farm environments, we're not working in a more sterile environment like you might see in various health profession settings like hospitals. Gloves can be useful for various farm activities, whether that's general protection when harvesting certain types of crops, whether that's, mixing chemicals, whether that's even an extra level of comfort in cold weather, or dealing with moving of any, wood boxes or anything that could cause splintering or any other harmful pieces, generally protecting your hands. So, but again, emphasis on doing this properly. This would be a key topic training piece that I would be sharing with employees. Now, there are various different types of gloves out there. We would recommend disposing of single-use gloves immediately. They are intended for that single-use purpose. They're not going to be very well adapted to multiple uses. For gloves that are reused, we would encourage a cleaning and sanitizing of those gloves on perhaps even more of a frequent basis than you may have been doing in the past. So keep that in mind. Think about what you are providing to employees, maybe what they are already bringing to the farm on their own. And then continue to follow whatever your existing food safety practices are. So different scales of food operations and processing may have different specific requirements around that, or you may have already had existing protocols. So continue to follow those to the extent possible. But in short supply, if you need to prioritize anything, I would prioritize gloves during working with hazard materials. Coming from the produce safety world, in terms just of a regulatory aspect, we don't require gloves in the handling of produce. Again, because of good hand washing should be sufficient in these situations. Additional item to be considering whether asking your employees to come to work with this, or to maybe be providing as well for employees. Or maybe there's someone that's got some sewing or is of a more creative nature that would love to jump on this opportunity. But the recommendation right now is from CDC and Department of Health. Now this is more of a newer recommendation, so if you haven't heard of this, this is something that's new. The requirement being that folks are using or wearing face masks in public settings, also in farm and food operation settings as well. Our goal and purpose is to protect others from from, your own coughing, spit, and saliva that may be, a byproduct. So it's trying to provide that physical barrier, but it in no means should be a substitute for physical distancing. There are other types of masks out there. Masks, you may have heard of N95 type masks. These are more technical masks that are designed to reduce the movement of very small viral particles that we see with COVID from entering, trying to protect that health worker. Those, however, the recommendation here is to reserve those for healthcare workers, but cloth is a good alternative that can be made from various different types of materials. And just in the last couple of days, I've seen an onslaught of different suggestions for how to do that. So I've linked below under this image for examples on that. Okay, again, same thing with gloves. And when you're training, don't assume what employees may or may not already know. There's lots of information out there, so people have picked up on various things. This would be one area to really reinforce. So best practices for face masks. Again, just like gloves, you want to be cleaning your hands before putting on the face mask. Fitting of the face masks is super important. I've seen different images out there specific to different types of face masks about the fit actually over the face is super important. There may be strategies for doing that better, I've even seen images out there of how to fit that for different size beards or face shapes and sizes. That may be something fun to look into, but you want to fit it snugly, clean your hands after that, and then really key here, trying to prevent touching your face and to be moving that face around, because again, now we've got germs and other particles on the inside of that mask that we don't want that mask itself to become a new contamination point. So you can lean over when taking it off, pulling it off your ears, and then throw that away as immediately possible. Clean, or if it's a reusable one, you can machine wash it. You can add, some machines have a function to do an extra sanitizer step, so that's recommended by CDC right now. If possible, it'd be great to have a few that you could rotate through, and then you can kind of decide really it makes sense to be changing those out. If you're stopping to eat food, maybe that's a time that you take off the mask, consume, and then put that face mask on. Again, this is when you're in a public setting or when you're. There are so many resources out there. I tend to point to the ones that are kind of leading us here from both on a national and state level. CDC and Department of Health have lots of resources in multiple languages if that's a need for you. So steps to prevent the spread. If you are sick or if you think any employee is sick, I would go to this resource. It's really done well. It's clean. It's got steps. And Department of Health, Washington Department of Health resources. In this process of developing this webinar and such, we have been getting a fair number of questions about, okay, well, what do I do if someone's sick? How do I know the extent of which transmission has already happened? The two biggies here would be to notify your local health department. They're going to be able to walk you through next steps, provide guidance, help you assess what the potential on-site of that was, maybe help assess how long you've been sick, what is the potential spread been depending on where you've been, whether it's been going to work, whether it's been going to the home environment. If you have any in place of any indication that they're sick, you would want to, unfortunate as it is, to be following isolation practices, the guidance under CDC, until it can be confirmed that you're no longer someone that's a potential carrier of the virus and is no longer feeling the symptoms of that. Additionally, following a disinfection program of your facility, as we'll talk about, as you already will be throughout. Cornell's got some really good resources on standard operating action plans, so don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel on that. L&I is another strong resource here. They've got tons of information. So between them, CDC and Department of Health, you're going to get a lot of the most up-to-date and accurate info you need. Okay, so how do you go about applying social distancing in your operation? Again, this is our priority one in terms of how we're looking to manage the spread. Again, this is a respiratory disease that's transferred via respiratory droplets that can be airborne. They could be on food contact surfaces. They could on food contact surfaces. However, the likelihood of that causing sickness as it's going through your body is less so. So what do we need to do here? What kinds of practices? How can we be shifting our operations? I think that's one of the key pieces we were looking to prioritize here in this training. So again, 6 feet distance at minimum. If you can do that based on the worker load, the types of activities that you have on your operation, if it's possible to maintain that, if not farther distance, that would be what we would recommend. You can see here in this image, 6 feet is pretty long, maybe longer than you would think. So maybe easy tool to have on the farm would be to actually get a measuring stick or to be using a tape measure. Some operations are actually, plotting out maybe via tape what the distances are at certain points of high density operation areas. I even think it might be hard to speak to someone at the distance of 6 feet. So if you can, using more technology to communicate for meetings or texting, there's lots of other apps that may be useful as well. But as much as you can do to communicate to employees, what are the daily tasks? Do you typically have a gathering in the morning where you talk about what are the priorities of the day? Is that something that maybe you can now do remotely in some fashion? Another piece of this that we've been seeing more and more is to be staggering shifts. So, is it possible for people to maybe not even be coming in at the same hours? I don't know if that's possible for your situation. Maybe that's rotating out when break areas or shared spaces for personal. Some people have like locker type area. Maybe that, even means just actually distancing people on the farm. This is maybe where there is a little bit of an advantage, or maybe slightly lower risk in a farm situation versus like a larger food manufacturing or food facility where really the concentration of the work happens all in one space, and it's hard, maybe hard to have good ventilation in those spaces. At least in outdoor environment, you know, the fact that we're in this open air environment is going to be helpful as long as we're keeping that distance. However, you know, as I was thinking through this, maybe areas of higher density might be a greenhouse, for example. I saw that UVM put together some standard operating procedures tied to these talking points here that you'll see, where they, you know, they actually set a minimum, for example, for how many people could be in the greenhouse at once. So that would totally depend on the size of the greenhouse, of course. And they were assigning even certain trays and activities to certain people. You know, if people are continuing to do the city on the farm, that may help also provide some distancing. Or maybe even if there are one or two people from the same household or living situation, you know, maybe they do similar activities because they're already practicing kind of their own, or should be practicing on their social distancing there in their own bubble there. So
Karen,
that
we had a question earlier about
yeah.
Packing produce activities, and going back to the mask question too, is it recommended to wear masks while packing produce?
Okay. Yeah. So is that was just a statement recommendation, or was there a question in
No,
there?
sorry, that's a question. Is it the recommendation?
Right. The recommendation would also be to be wearing masks during that situation, as long as, you know, especially given that you are communicating how to do properly.
I jump in there real quick. I'm not sure if, I think the issue really there is if you're coming in contact with other people. So if it's just an individual packing produce and have good hand washing procedures, there is not necessarily a recommendation that you would wear a mask in that situation, unless it was because there was no way to enforce this minimum 6-foot social distancing. Now, you might feel more comfortable wearing a mask if there's concern that that person is talking. I mean, if that person's sneezing, they shouldn't be at work at all. So that's the first thing. And if there's some thought that they might be spitting on the produce, you might have bigger problems. Not to make light of that, but I think the question is really about masks are to be used as a risk mitigation factor when you're not able to enforce that physical distance. So it depends a bit on the scenario that your produce packing is happening in.
Similarly, want to be limiting the sharing of tools and equipment, or thinking about a cleaning and sanitizing step between uses. Okay, some other good practices here would be thinking about, again, this goes back to visitor, customer interaction. We listed some ideas and practices here. Going back to, again, trying to keep that, you know, physical distancing as much as possible. Are there ways to continue to operate where there is no interaction with the customer, whether that's going more to an online circumstance, whether that's you know, at the point of handing off produce to a customer, you know, can that be made in advance? Can it be taken to the customer at their car? Maybe not even directly to the person, but maybe you can unload some of that, you know, maybe into their back seat. We're not going to touch on this a ton because there's lots of resources out there on this already, and there's some follow-up webinars I'm going to point you to. But generally, some other good practices would be cleaning those areas, those high-touch areas that both you and the customer may be operating in. You know, consider wearing face masks, using gloves in this environment for, you know, handling money, credit cards and such, because those could be a transfer point. And in general, now this is something that some farms may already be doing. It's kind of a general food safety practice, but tracking coming to the operation via a log. And this can help in the event that you or someone else that had been at the farm were to be sick. It can be help in tracing back to where contamination or where infection may have occurred, and what is the extent beyond that to what we think others or other things may be contaminated. So, and here's just an example of some signage that you can consider adding. So customer communication is important here. What the take-home message I want to be pointing out to you is maybe one, finding ways with however you are already communicating with customers, without whatever method you are communicating with them, whether that's social media, whether that's a newsletter, you know, whether that's signage, to let them know that, you know, you are following good public health measures, and whatever that means for your kind of operational structure, that can provide them some assurances that they can continue to feel safe, you know, consuming your product. And then also, if they are coming to your farm, or if there's another drop point, let them know how they can be supportive of protecting, you know, your own businesses, you know, the public health, the safety of your employees, but also general public health measures. Washington State Farmers Market Association and Department of Health have done a lot in this category, like thinking about the retail side of things that tend to do a lot of interaction with customers. So I would go to their website. That would be one of the first places I would go for more information for thinking around this. As an example, I just included example for one of the ways you might look at communicating. This would probably come in a signed format, but I could also see someone like reinforcing this in their newsletter, whatever method they're already using. Okay. So wrapping up all of that social distancing information and content, now that we are having to adjust to the situation, consider contingency planning, other called continuation of business planning. They are similar in concept to planning, you know, in the event contamination related to produce. It's yourself to write down what steps you would do kind of in those worst case, you know, if, for example, a significant portion force were to get sick, or, you know, heaven forbid, you know, you were to be sick, is there someone that you can you relay that to someone else in the operation, give them that kind of leadership piece, or what is the next plan? So the resources I have linked here are super good at kind of almost a checklist item of thinking through what are those considerations you would want to have. Maybe it's related to suppliers. Maybe it's to what are those alternative markets going to be. I know lots of folks are already doing that already. And you might consider breaking it up into, okay, priorities. So what are things that we're going to continue to do now? What are things that maybe we can do at reduced capacity in terms of number of folks working on that? And then maybe things that we want to discontinue until until safer precautions are in place, or until we're kind of operating in more environments. So those might include, like we already mentioned, the in-person meetings, farm tour. At this point, I think for sake of time, we might not want to open it up for discussion, but I think I would, if people are already doing good things around just like the last 5 slides that we talked about in terms of really good ideas around how they're actually enforcing social distancing, we would really love to hear what those are, to be continuing to help and inspire others for ways to work around this. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving, but if we have time, let's talk about those a little bit more at the end. Okay, so the last
Karen,
two steps, yeah.
One was on any information on wax boxes and how those would be treated as far as sanitizing goes.
Okay. Questions on wax boxes. So I'm assuming maybe this caller is using fresh as a produce grower. I'm guessing the general recommendation is to be cleaning and sanitizing. I mean, that's already established recommendations, is to be cleaning and sanitizing those surfaces. Cardboard can be challenging in this category. Some strategies I've seen around to be including like a wax liner. I would say if it's not, feasible or economically viable for you to be purchasing other continually new information, let me backtrack. The challenge with cardboard is it can be challenging to clean and sanitize. In the event, the other thing that goes with this is, if it's not economically feasible to be adjusting your packaging materials to an alternative type of material, another best practices would be to not be reusing cardboards from sources that you may not know how those materials were handled prior to it being in your control. So I think it's going to depend a little bit on, where those boxes are going and to who. This is an ongoing and important topic that's challenging for farms of all scales, I can tell you right now. So let's continue to keep in the loop on that. But again, our focus with this COVID outbreak is more in that human-to-human reduction. The produce itself and the food concept are, we cannot conceptually disclude those as potential risk areas, but if we're trying to frame our risk mitigation practices against what the research is leading to us now, it's on reducing that human to human.
Another quick specific surface sanitizing question before you open it up again. The question is, do we know whether peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide mixtures like pyrosan that many folks use in organic operations, if that kills COVID on surfaces?
So we're going to be talking about sanitation right now. I'm going to jump through a couple of key pieces on that.
Great.
Okay. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think a lot of farms are already doing some of these practices. The existing standard is to be cleaning non-food contact surfaces, cleaning and sanitizing non-surfaces, and food contact surfaces in particular. What is new COVID is that we are encouraging, as a backdrop to social distancing, is more frequent cleaning of high touch points. So this is one of the new concepts, maybe newer concepts for folks out there. There are basically what we're used to in these settings is to do a cleaning and sanitizing step. With COVID, those high touch points, we are looking at using higher levels of types of chemicals that will be stronger at disinfecting, disinfecting in particular those non-food contact surfaces that are touch points, such as doorknobs, screens, faucet handles. Those are the areas that we want to be focusing on more so on. There are various common disinfectants you can use for this process. CDC is recommending a higher concentration of bleach. Note that there are some particulars around the fact that bleach can lose efficacy over time. If any of this is new to you, or dealing with chemicals is uncomfortable, I would really highly recommend COVID-19 Disinfecting with Bleach from Michigan State University. Step-by-step instructions on how to dilute it properly, how to use it properly, how to make sure you're not using an expired bleach. Also know that you can use other items such as isopropyl alcohol, hydrogen peroxide. Please, please, please be cleaning your surfaces before you're applying these products. Read the label because they may have specifics around how to protect yourself for hazard warnings. Maybe it may be requiring glove use, and also make sure that you're not mixing sanitizers in ways that are not recommended. This slide, lots of content. Don't feel overwhelmed by this. This is really just tailored for the folks in the audience. They may already be using sanitizers, for example, in their produce wash water. Know that it may be possible to still use those products at a higher concentration for the sanitizing and disinfecting that we're looking for in these situations. I've also linked down here to what's allowable under USDA organic standards if you're needing to comply with that as well. The core source, however, for understanding which disinfectants are recommended by EPA for disinfection is what they're calling the List N. We don't currently have products that are specifically targeted at decreasing the presence of this new COVID, but there are related viruses that could be a good stand-in at this point. Typically, they have active ingredients that are common to the ones that we mentioned in the earlier slide. So check out this list. I've also linked to ODA's list that they've recently come out with. My thinking there is that maybe there's some brands that you recognize, maybe they're a little bit more available in the Pacific Northwest. These are just general frequency recommendations for how often you should be cleaning and sanitizing and disinfecting. These are recommendations. Really be thinking about not just what the operation is looking like now, but what is the operation going to look like once we're into the growing season, the harvesting. That's when I think we're going to have a higher density of various activities going on, when there may be a higher density of people operating in the same space. It would be a good idea to have a process that you list out for employees about when to do that, so it's really clear, crystal clear, who's doing what, when, and what are your expectations. So there's examples, there's already existing templates that you can use out there. Were there questions that maybe I didn't address just let's just keep to topics of cleaning and sanitizing. Okay. Just got a couple more slides here. So this presentation was really focused on the COVID response. Now, that's not to say that your existing food safety protocols are still important. They help to protect and are designed to help to protect against the foodborne illnesses that we have in our environment, that still exist in our environment. So continue to use those, rely on those as kind of your foundational point. Know that regulations that existed prior to COVID are, still in effect. Know that we are seeing a fair amount of delays, or we're seeing postponements of regular inspections in many categories for different food processing, food product handling types. So if your business has questions on that, WSDA and Department of Health would be people to check on in terms of what their status is. Nonetheless, we are in ongoing resource agency-wide for finding out what that is or finding out what to do in the interim. Some basic practices that we can pull from food safety: remember, providing clean and potable water, just good general manufacturing practices that you would see in facilities, such as, having no waste baskets, disposing of those single-use items as quickly as possible, making sure the trash is getting taken out in a reasonable manner. In general, minimizing cross-contamination from animals. I want to wrap it up just by reinforcing what the goals are of what we're trying to do in terms of reducing that person-to-person transmission via, air droplets, saliva, maybe to some degree cross-contamination via food surfaces. But what we want to emphasize is social distancing, frequent and hand washing, and sanitation of high-touch surfaces. We've got additional resources here. There's some good follow-up webinars that if you're wanting to learn more about that retail side, how to deal with customers, I would recommend you best practices at farmers markets coming up next week. But I want to pause here and take time for comments and questions at this point.